It's my pleasure today to introduce Patrick Mason, who is the Howard W. Hunter Chair of Mormon Studies and Associate Professor of North American Religion at Claremont Graduate University. Before joining the CGU faculty, Patrick Mason served as the Associate Director of the Contending Modernities Project at the Joan B. Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He is the author of The Mormon Menace, Violence and Anti-Mormonism in the Post-Bellum South. That was published by Oxford University Press in 2011. He's also written a good number of articles and book chapters on Mormonism and American religious history. His current research projects include a biography of Ezra Taft Benson and a book on Mormon theology and the ethics of peace. His talk today is Religious Militancy, from Violent Extremism to Active Nonviolence. Please join me in welcoming Patrick Mason today.
Thanks, Wendy. And now I'm going to feel really disappointed if you don't have great questions at the end. Well, thanks. It's great to be here and to be part of this terrific lineup of speakers that you've had all semester. What I'm going to be doing today, as Wendy indicated, my primary field is as an American religious historian, but I also have a master's degree in international peace studies. And this is something that I was actually in the middle of my doctoral degree in history. I actually didn't know there was such a thing as peace studies until I went to graduate school and encountered it. And I was so entranced with it on lots of different levels, both analytical and personal and normative levels, that I actually left my doctoral program in history to go get this master's degree in peace studies. It was still at Notre Dame. I was still at the university, but I had to reapply and go to a different program and all that kind of stuff before going back and finishing my doctorate degree. And at the time, some of my advisors and professors in history said, "What are you doing? I mean, why are you leaving a doctoral program to go get a master's degree? And in peace studies?" You know, and I'm glad that for most of my career I followed their advice, but on this point I was glad that I ignored their advice and went and got this master's degree. And peace studies is an inherently interdisciplinary field. It comes originally out of political science, primarily in Europe in the 1950s and 60s. But since then, it has encompassed just about every possible field you could think of. Because the pursuit of peace is seeking to eradicate all forms of violence, not only direct violence, as we think of, but also structural and cultural violence, also environmental violence and gender violence and things like that. And so actually it draws on a wide range of fields, not only political science, but history, anthropology, psychology, religion, gender studies, increasingly the hard sciences and engineering as we think about development and poverty issues, business, and interesting new alliances with business. And so it's an exciting field. And even though my primary research is in American religious history, I try to keep at least a foot or a toe in peace studies. And so what I'm going to talk about today is this is a shorter version. The lecture I'm going to give you today is a shorter version of an article I've just written for a forthcoming Oxford Handbook on Religion, Conflict, and Peace Building. And my assigned topic was religious militancy. So you're going to get a taste of this. And the assigned reading that I'd sent out ahead of time from Scott Appleby, you'll see echoes of Appleby and his argument in my paper. Appleby's book called The Ambivalence of the Sacred is really formative. It's in some ways the foundational text in this new field of religion, conflict, and peace building. So you'll find echoes of it in what I'm doing, and we can certainly talk about it in the question and answer period. But I'll just go ahead and then we'll talk. So one of the central questions that bedevils scholars is why some people are violent and others are not, even when they share similar cultural, economic, political, and educational backgrounds. The The question also has clear policy implications as we think about such issues as criminal justice, rehabilitation and reintegration, conflict resolution, and educational planning and pedagogy, to name a few. Even where scholars have been able to describe ex post facto the conditions that led to a particular expression of violence, our current tools of analysis remain inadequate in their predictive capacity, particularly when it comes to the individual actor. By the same token, no definitive answer exists for why some people are militantly peaceful, even to the point of choosing to lay down their lives rather than commit aggression. Today, I don't offer any grand theory that solves the problem, but rather I'll employ a descriptive and analytical approach to understanding religious militancy. However, I'm not objective, strictly speaking. My scholarship has a clear normative dimension, consonant with the emerging interdisciplinary field of peace studies. My hope is that we can move closer to identifying, predicting, and preventing religiously motivated violence while encouraging an active religious commitment to nonviolence. For most people, religious militancy equals violence. The long-standing relationship of religion and violence has provided critics of faith with a powerful argument for why, in the words of the late Christopher Hitchens, God is not great, and religion poisons everything. Hitchens opened a chapter on religious violence, subtly titled Religion Kills. Hitchens was nothing if not subtle, with an epigraph from John Stuart Mill speaking about his father's aversion to religion, which he decried as a great moral evil that required obedience to a being on whom it lavishes indeed all the phrases of adulation, but whom in sober truth it depicts as eminently hateful. According to Hitchens, the problem with religion, or at least one in a long list, is its absolutism. Because believers claim to possess the grand interpretive scheme that allows them to decipher all of life and the cosmos, they translate that sacred knowledge into divinely ordained authoritarianism. The true believer, Hitchens says, cannot rest until the whole world bows the knee. Is it not obvious to all, say the pious, that religious authority is paramount, and that those who decline to recognize it have forfeited their right to exist? The enactment of deadly violence is the most dramatic expression of this denial of the right of others to exist. Hitchens sees a clear connection between piety and the inclination and capacity for violence, claiming that the al-Qaeda operatives who hijacked the planes on September 11, 2001, were beyond any doubt the most sincere believers on those planes. Their jihadism, in turn, resurrected a strand of Christian crusaderism that found expression in the public sermons and statements of ministers, pundits, and politicians across the United States, including, briefly, the president, and helped contribute to the Iraq War. From the former Yugoslavia to the Middle East to Sri Lanka, the evidence is in, Hitchens reckoned, and religion is found guilty of widespread and wanton murder. As well as a menace to civilization, he concluded, religion has become a threat to human survival. So even if we set aside some of Hitchens' characteristic bombast and hyperbole, for instance, we know that not all of the 9/11 hijackers were devout in any traditional sense, whereas many of their victims were, the claim that religion has been the prime mover behind the world's violence is commonly made not just by atheist critics, but also by many believers. Charles Kimball, a religion scholar and Baptist minister, opened his best-selling book, When Religion Becomes Evil, with the assertion, it is somewhat trite, but nevertheless sadly true, to say that more wars have been waged, more people killed, and these days more evil perpetrated in the name of religion than by any institutional force in human history. Though powerful and commonly held, this particular claim is empirically false. The fact is that, especially in the modern world, the secular nation-state is far and away the greatest purveyor of violence. The human toll of the Nazi death camps, the Stalinist and Maoist purges, the Khmer Rouge's killing fields, and the Rwandan genocide, all secular and state-sponsored affairs, vastly outranks anything to be laid at the feet of religion. To be fair, the relatively lower body count of religious violence may simply be a matter of capacity, as religious actors typically don't command the organizational wherewithal, let alone firepower, that allowed agents of the state to murder as many as 262 million people worldwide in the 20th century, and that does not include wars. This is not to let religion off the hook. Indeed, the scope and severity of the violence perpetrated in the name of religion need not be inflated to be seriously analyzed and critiqued. But beyond interrogating some of the more overblown claims about religion and violence, especially relative to the destructiveness of state-sponsored violence, one of the most productive developments in this area in recent years has been the increasing recognition that religion is not only violent, but that it has also contributed powerfully to peace and justice movements around the world, let alone countless individual and organizational acts of charity and compassion. To argue that religion is either inherently violent or peaceful is to peddle in crass reductionism, ignoring tremendous diversity within and between religious traditions, as well as the complexity and indeed messiness naturally attendant to human relations and institutions. So one of the most important articulations of this more nuanced thesis is Scott Appleby's Ambivalence of the Sacred, which you read chapter 1 from. Appleby contends that religion, precisely because it deals with matters of the divine, calls on its adherents to make, or at least be prepared to make, the ultimate commitment and sacrifice on behalf of what is perceived to be the godly cause. In its unmoderated form, religion naturally produces what he terms militants, those who are consumed with sacred rage. Contra Hitchens' unidirectional relationship between religion and violence, however, Appleby's key insight is that religious militancy takes different forms, including rage-filled protesters who fight against the very forms of physical, structural, and cultural violence that their co-religionists wreak. Religious militants of different stripes can simultaneously be found systematically violating human rights and organizing campaigns to protect and enforce those same rights. As Appleby observes, militant religion, in short, produces a broad spectrum of religious actors with differing attitudes toward the pursuit of political power and the use of violence. Applying a taxonomy in which militant is the generic term and extremist describes those who use violence to accomplish their ends, he continues, both the extremists and the peacemakers are militants. Both types go to extremes of self-sacrifice and devotion to the sacred. Both claim to be radical or rooted in and renewing the fundamental truths of their religious traditions. In these ways, they distinguish themselves from people not motivated by religious commitments and from the vast middle ground of believers. Yet the peacemaker renounces violence as an acceptable extreme and restricts the war against oppressors and injustice to non-coercive means. The extremist, by contrast, exalts violence as a religious prerogative or even as a spiritual imperative in the quest for justice. The ultimate difference between religious peacemakers and extremists, Appleby asserts, is not in their commitment, but rather in their orientation. The religious peacemaker is motivated by and seeks reconciliation or peaceful coexistence with the enemy as the ultimate goal, whereas the violent extremist is committed primarily to victory over the enemy, and thus may sanction the use of violence as a godly means of achieving her sacred ends. What I want to do in the rest of my lecture today is to build upon Appleby's arguments by considering the notion of religious militancy from a range of different disciplines, from theology to political science to psychology. Then I'll illustrate what I'm talking about through a historical illustration of the competing dynamics of religious militancy present in the struggle over the Black civil rights movement in the American South in the 1950s and 60s. And then I'll conclude by offering a few reflections on how religious militancy might be more effectively deployed in the service of greater peace and justice, or what we might call just peace, rather than further contributing to cycles of violence. In his widely read 1957 book, Dynamics of Faith, the influential mid-20th century Protestant theologian Paul Tillich defined faith as the state of being ultimately concerned. Though grounded in Tillich's own Christian tradition, his notion of faith as concerned with the ultimate, the unconditional, the absolute, the infinite, provides an instructive foundation for considering the broader phenomenon of religious militancy. The dynamics of this ultimate concern include not only the unconditional demand required of believers, but also the promise of ultimate fulfillment, which entices them as the reward for a faithful life. Tillich noted that faith as ultimate concern is an act of the total personality. It happens in the center of the personal life and includes all its elements. Faith is not simply the sum total of one's commitments, beliefs, and actions, but rather transcends and exercises a decisive impact on each of them. Tillich recognized the political implications of ultimate concern, and that its application is by no means limited to what we might commonly refer to as the religious. In illustrating his concept, he initially pointed not to Scripture or to sacred history, but rather to the modern secular nation-state. He incisively observed, if a national group makes the life and growth of the nation its ultimate concern, it demands that all other concerns, economic well-being, health and life, family, aesthetic and cognitive truth, justice and humanity, be sacrificed. The extreme nationalisms of the 20th century are laboratories for the study of what ultimate concern means in all aspects of human existence, including the smallest concern of one's daily life. Everything is centered on the only God, the nation, a God who certainly proves to be a demon, but who shows clearly the unconditional character of an ultimate concern. Tillich's concept has resonated far beyond his immediate circle of Protestant theology. In considering the rise of extremist religious groups in modern Israel, political scientist Charles Liebman began from the Tillichian promise that religion claims absolute truth about ultimate reality, then concluded that extremism is an understandable and, other things being equal, the most obvious consequence of religious commitment. In short, extremism is the religious norm. As a logical corollary, then, it is not religious extremism, but religious moderation that requires explanation. Liebman elaborated his basic thesis. He said, a propensity to religious extremism does not require explanation since it is entirely consistent with basic religious tenets and authentic religious orientations. It is religious moderation or religious liberalism, the willingness of religious adherents to accommodate themselves to their environment, to adapt their behavioral and belief patterns to prevailing cultural norms, to make peace with the world, that requires explanation. Extremism is a tendency to which every religiously oriented person is attracted. Given the totalizing demands made by the sacred, extremism, or in this essay's parlance, religious militancy, is the default position. We can find scriptural support for this position in a variety of the world's religious texts. From the Hebrew Bible, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. The Quran, there's no God but I, therefore worship and serve me. The Bhagavad Gita, fix your mind on me, be devoted to me, offer service to me, bow down to me, and you shall certainly reach me. Or even from Chinese philosophy, the superior man, taking his stance as righteousness requires, adheres firmly to heaven's decrees. Liebman's argument that religious extremism is the norm is not without its critics. Religious studies scholar John Cumsty accuses Liebman of being quite extraordinarily reductionist, in the sense of selecting one manifestation of religious behavior and belief and then declaring it as normative for all religion. Cumsty further states that when one begins with extremism as the religious norm, a number of analytical problems ensue. For instance, it becomes difficult to determine where religion ends and where the lunatic fringe begins. Furthermore, it can have the effect of exacerbating the tendency that scholars and practitioners of religion have long struggled against in secular societies, namely the association of religion as a non-normative phenomenon that can easily be dismissed or at least not considered to be intellectually serious. Finally, the claim that extremism requires no explanation fails to pay adequate attention to the dynamics in which followers exercise agency in choosing or legitimating a particular religious leader or movement. It is the total religious culture that gives life, shape, and meaning to extremism or any other religious manifestation or mode, not something inherent in religion itself. The debate between these two scholars emphasizes that it is essential to differentiate militancy as an ideal type that is normative in the sense of being the logical embodiment of the absolutist claims and tendencies within religious discourse, but not normative in a descriptive sense of capturing the belief and practice of the vast majority of religious adherents. Speaking descriptively, moderation or accommodationism is a far more the norm than is militancy. Thus, it may be more accurate, or at least more encompassing, to say that extremism or militancy is a religious norm rather than the religious norm. For many years in the middle part of the 20th century, a nuanced discussion of religious militancy would have been considered arcane and largely irrelevant to the general functioning of society. After all, theories of secularization posited that religion was in the final stages of succumbing to the steady march of progress and secular enlightenment, and any brief flare-up of religion in the public sphere was simply a manifestation of the desperate last gasps of a dying God. The increasingly marginalized role of religion in the industrial West prompted Time magazine to famously ask on the cover of its April 8, 1966 issue, "Is God dead?" This question was answered by believers around the world in the next decade with the most decisive no. So we can see here all kinds of examples from the 1970s today where religion has been manifested in the public sphere in really remarkable ways. Numerous authors have since written on the global resurgence of religion in the last quarter of the 20th century. French scholar Gilles Capel memorably dubbed the trend the revenge of God, which he described as a new religious approach aimed no longer at adapting to secular values, but at recovering a sacred foundation for the organization of society, by changing society if necessary. Of course, the most striking and troubling aspect of this resurgence of religion in the public sphere has been the highly visible and globalized outbreak of religiously inspired violence, of which the September 11th terrorist attacks in the United States are only the most famous example. In the past decade, there has emerged a cottage industry of scholars from a range of disciplines seeking to understand the phenomenon of religiously inspired violence. One of the most popular of these has been the book Terror in the Mind of God by political sociologist Mark Juergensmeyer. Any of you read this in your undergraduate classes? It's a very common text assigned in undergraduate classes. In his book, Juergensmeyer profiles a number of cases of religiously motivated violence across several of the world's major traditions, including Christian abortion clinic bombers and paramilitary groups, Jewish and Sikh assassins of political leaders, Muslim suicide bombers, and the Japanese Buddhist Aum Shinrikyo poison gas attack in Tokyo. Although recognizing that most of these acts of violence had clear political implications and even motivations, Juergensmeyer insists that they were at heart acts of religious militancy. Religion, he says, is crucial for these acts since it gives moral justification for killing and provides images of cosmic war that allow activists to believe that they are waging spiritual scenarios. This notion of cosmic war, in which the participants are part of a much broader struggle between the forces of good and evil in which they're called to play a decisive role, is central to Juergensmeyer's analysis, and it's the key ingredient of his argument that there is a strain of violence that may be found at the deepest levels of the religious imagination. Acknowledging that his cases represent a minority strand in the broad spectrum of religious experience and behavior, he nevertheless locates the central logic of religious violence in the essential core of the religious imagination, which has always had the propensity to absolutize and to project images of cosmic war. I think there's some problems with Juergensmeyer's analysis. We can talk about that later if you want. In any case, another recent attempt to understand the relationship between violence and all forms of extremism, religious and secular, comes from a group of psychologists examining what they call the fundamentalist mindset. They argue that the fundamentalist mindset, wherever it occurs, is composed of distinct characteristics, including dualistic thinking, paranoia and rage in a group context, an apocalyptic orientation that incorporates distinct perspectives on time, death, and violence, a relationship to charismatic leadership, and a totalized conversion experience. They claim that this mindset finds expression in a variety of human institutions, including religion, but not restricted to it. Thus, the terror of the French Revolution is analyzed alongside contemporary apocalyptic Christianity in the United States, and Nazism fits alongside Hindu-Muslim violence in post-partition India. These scholars are admittedly concerned with extremists and fanatics and want to separate their subjects from the large number of believers, even self-described fundamentalists, who do not display the same psychological characteristics and are thus not so prone to violence. At the same time, these psychologists argue that it's an entirely different psychological mindset that contributes to what we might call positive or peaceful religious militancy, whether it be antebellum religious reformers in the United States seeking to end slavery, or the utopian dreams of racial harmony called for by Martin Luther King Jr. In short, the psychological profile of what we might call the peacemaker mindset thus remains unmapped. So as we've seen, scholars from a number of different disciplines, theology, political science, sociology, psychology, and the list could go on, have all sought to understand the relationship of religion and violence. This is all important work, and events of recent years show it's anything but a purely academic exercise in the narrow sense of the term. Nevertheless, there's a problem with much of this literature. By continuing to equate religious militancy with violence, scholars, not to mention the mass media and general public, will continue to subtly, if often unintentionally, reinforce the secularist assumption that religion is a problem that needs to be solved, if not altogether eliminated. Furthermore, the marginalization of religion as a powerful social actor and the commonly held association, if not equation, of religion and violence renders the task of religiously militant peacemakers that much more difficult, as they must argue for their own legitimacy within both peacemaking and religious circles, even before making their argument with violence. The human fascination with violence is well established, but there's a moral as well as analytical duty for scholars to expand their circle of inquiry to give due attention to all forms of religious militancy, from the violent to the nonviolent. And so to talk in more concrete terms about what I'm saying, I want to spend a few minutes showing how the ambivalence of the sacred operated in a particular historical context, specifically the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s. So the Civil Rights Movement has become part of America's national narrative. Martin Luther King now has a monument on the National Mall right alongside Washington and Jefferson. But what we often forget, however, is that at its core, the movement was a profoundly religious contest, and that its primary battlegrounds were theaters of complex theological drama. As recent scholars, including Charles Marsh and David Chappelle, have pointed out, many, if not most, of the principal combatants in the struggle viewed the arenas of battle in Montgomery, Little Rock, Nashville, Birmingham, Oxford, and the Supreme Court as proximate sites in a cosmic struggle between good and evil, not simply competing ideas of racial identity or constitutional democracy. To be sure, the movement featured its fair share of protagonists who operated within a predominantly secular paradigm, but for the foot soldiers on both sides, from nonviolent civil rights activists to violent Ku Klux Klansmen, theirs was God's work, and it demanded their ultimate concern and sacrifice. We can rightly frame the civil rights movement as a battle of competing religious militancies, ranging from the radically nonviolent to the heinously violent, because that is how the combatants themselves framed it. Martin Luther King considered himself to be a militant. In his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, one of the classics in American letters, he responded to some of his critics who had accused him of extremism. He said, "But though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? Was not Martin Luther an extremist, and Abraham Lincoln, and Thomas Jefferson? So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? Perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. We see in this passage not only the multiple trajectories of religious militancy, including King's preferred militancy for love and justice, but also the profoundly religious roots of King's worldview. This wasn't isolated to King, an ordained minister. But in fact, this deeply biblical worldview suffused the movement, particularly on the level of the grassroots black activists in the South. One, a radical activist in South Carolina from the 1940s onward, framed the struggle in biblical terms. She cited the Apostle Paul's letter to the Ephesians, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, a frequent victim of white supremacist intimidation and violence, referred to the movement as a crusade. Reverend Shuttlesworth invoked the dualistic and militaristic language common in expressions of religious militancy. This is a religious crusade, a fight between light and darkness, right and wrong, good and evil, fair play and tyranny. We are assured of victory because we're using weapons of spiritual warfare. Another one of the most powerful voices of the movement was Mississippi sharecropper turned activist Fannie Lou Hamer. She's commonly remembered for her political mobilizing of poor blacks in rural Mississippi, and she endured both physical and sexual torture by local and state law enforcement officers for her activism. What compelled Hamer to persist through beatings and threats and molestation to establish a new society based on freedom, justice, and most of all, love? According to Hamer, her motivation was a radical Christian faith that compelled her to action. She was critical of not only white supremacists, but also Christians, black and white, who stayed on the sidelines during the struggle. The real Christians, the real militants, were the activists who were willing to sacrifice everything, including their own lives, for the cause. For Hamer, if religion was not radical, if it wasn't militant, then it wasn't real religion. Christ was a revolutionary person, she asserted, out there where it was happening. Similarly, she said, if Christ were here today, he would be just like these young people who the Southerners call radicals. The purpose of the movement for Hamer was not to fulfill Jefferson's creed, but was rather about the beginning of a new kingdom of God right here on earth. Those fighting for greater rights and equality for African Americans were not the only ones compelled by militant religious convictions in the 1950s and 60s. On the other side of the fight was Sam Bowers, imperial wizard of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Bowers led a 4-year campaign of terror in Mississippi, in which he was suspected of orchestrating at least 9 murders, 75 bombings of black churches, and 300 assaults, bombings, and beatings. Bowers was motivated not simply by racial hatred, but also by what he believed was a divine calling and destiny to eliminate what he called heretics. In a recruiting poster, he referred to civil rights workers as dedicated agents of Satan, who were absolutely determined to destroy Christian civilization and all Christians. By contrast, he and his Klansmen followers were the true followers of Jesus, who were militantly determined to preserve their nation, their liberty, and their religion. Bowers' hate was not limited to blacks. He also hated Jews and Catholics. Bowers' life had, for the most part, been without distinction until he heard God speak to him in a powerful epiphany that left him convinced that he had a special role to play in a larger cosmic drama in which the forces of good and evil were arrayed against one another. He acknowledged that he had gone beyond the point of moderate, socially acceptable religion, claiming, to be saved, one must go to the point of insanity. Bowers decided to devote his life to doing anything that God called him to do in preserving the purity and soul of his native Mississippi. What God called Bowers to do was to lead an armed vigilante movement against the outside agitators who were invading his home state and threatening to undermine its white Christian character. A voracious reader of religious texts, Bowers knew that the teachings of Jesus were not readily put to use in justifying terrorist violence. His answer reveals the elasticity of Scripture and theology to support a desired agenda. As Christians, he said, we are disposed to kindness, generosity, affection, and humility in our dealings with others. As militants, we are disposed to use physical force against our enemies. How are we to reconcile these two apparently contradictory philosophies? The answer, of course, is to purge malice, bitterness, and vengeance from our heart. If it is necessary to eliminate someone, it should be done with no malice, in complete silence, and in the manner of a Christian act. With the murders of civil rights activists Vernon Dahmer, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, as well as the hundreds of other acts of violence and intimidation against blacks and whites fighting for interracialism and equality, Bowers proved that his religious militancy was not an abstract ideal. So what emerges from this brief and selective portrayal is a concrete illustration of the dynamics of religious militancy at place in a particular time and place. The lives and worldviews of activists on all sides of the battle over black civil rights were powerfully shaped by their respective individual and communal images of God and their readings of Scripture and tradition. All were convinced that theirs was a righteous cause and that God was on their side. Yet their religious militancy, though drawing from the same Christian scriptures and invoking the same Christian God, led them down radically different paths. For all of these militants, from the radically nonviolent to the terribly violent, God demanded everything of them: their total commitment, ultimate concern, and complete willingness to sacrifice their own lives, if necessary, in a righteous cause. No doubt secular causes muster similar devotion. One need look no further than the millions who have killed and died for their country since the advent of nationalism. But at least in this particular context, in the civil rights movement, it was those activists motivated by deep-seated religious commitments born of radical encounters with the divine who were most willing to give up their lives and bodies, or in the case of Bowers, to give up other people's lives and bodies, for their apprehension of the coming kingdom of God. David Chappelle proposes that no other explanation suffices for the ultimate commitment demonstrated by the powerful, nonviolent witness of the core civil rights activists. He said, "It's hard to imagine masses of people lining up for years of excruciating risk against Southern sheriffs, fire hoses, and attack dogs without some transcendent or millennial faith to sustain them. It's hard to imagine such faith being sustained without emotional mass rituals, without something extreme and extraordinary to link the masses' spirits. It's impossible to ignore how often the participants carried their movement out in prophetic, ecstatic, biblical tones." Similarly illustrative scenarios we could draw from virtually any other country and religious tradition. And together, they provide an empirical base of case studies upon which scholars can continue to theorize and problematize the roots, nature, and dynamics of religious militancy in both its violent and nonviolent manifestations. But in the end, our theories and analyses will only be as valuable as the concrete realities they purport to explain. So as I mentioned at the beginning, while I proposed that we should be analytically comfortable with the ambivalence of the sacred, I don't believe that we should be comfortable with the violent aspects of religious militancy, or any violence for that matter, in a normative sense. So how do we harness religious militancy for peace while marginalizing religion's destructive capacity? And here I just want to offer a couple of thoughts in conclusion. In the arena of conflict prevention, religious peace builders must engage on at least three fronts: seriously engaging and then besting the arguments of violent militants, finding ways to capture the great mass of people who are not militants at all, but rather exist in the broad path of casual moderation, and directly naming and challenging the underlying violence of the modern nation-state. Peace-building is best served not by completely diffusing the fervor of religious militancy, which it can never do, but rather by harnessing its potency in the direction of nonviolence and justice. The primary battle for believers' hearts and minds is fought within each individual tradition, often at the local level of the church, the synagogue, the mosque, or the temple. It is not enough to casually dismiss violence as an inauthentic expression of faith. It's a temptation for peace builders to be glib about their own righteousness while dismissing their violent opponents as hopelessly misguided and even demonic, thus mimicking the very processes of demonization and othering that help give rise to violence in the first place. Rather, peace-building militants must be able to mount a convincing, even overwhelming argument based robustly on the theology, ritual, and ethics of their particular tradition that will resonate with the faithful majority of religious leaders and laity who have not had the training or occasion to think deeply about these issues and who can otherwise be swayed by the seductive logic of violence in a moment of crisis. In so doing, peacemakers must seriously engage the rhetoric, symbols, and narratives that are invoked by violent militants in convincing fellow believers that theirs is God's cause. In short, peace builders must try to win the argument. Religious militants for peace will not only denounce religiously motivated extremism, but also level a poignant critique at the structures, practices, and widespread acceptability of the violence of the secular nation-state. Religious militants need not be critical of secularism per se. Indeed, a liberal secular pluralism that grants the public recognition and influence of religion and religious actors may be the best pragmatic political option in many, if not most, places, and can be congenial to the aims of religiously militant peace builders. The excesses and idolatries of religious nationalism are easily spotted targets here, as are religious actors who use the state machinery in both democratic and totalitarian systems to advance their own, often exclusionary and even violent purposes. But a deep religious commitment to peace and justice will also seek to historicize and deconstruct the monopoly on violence that has been at the foundation of the modern state-building project from Westphalia to the present. Religious peace builders will not seek to reclaim the right to violence from the state, but rather to call out all the forms of physical, structural, and cultural violence wrought by the ultimate concern of secular nationalism. Religiously militant peace builders must therefore go beyond, without neglecting, individualist ethics, and they must think structurally, accounting for the structures of power, inequality, and violence that are endemic in a world dominated by sovereign nation-states and transnational corporations. Again, this does not mean an assault on the accommodating processes of a pluralistic and presumably secular public sphere, though questions can and should be asked about who is privileged in these particular arrangements. But militants for peace cannot settle for countering the violent extremism within their own religious tradition or others. They must adopt a comprehensive approach that considers state violence, gender-based violence, economic violence, and other impediments to a fuller realization of a social order characterized by just peace. So I'll leave it there, and we can talk further. Thanks.
Questions? Here. Megan, just wait a second.
So my question is, I guess, on how we're using violence and how we're using peace. So you kind of went into the different aspects of violence, like economic, gender, all these different areas. Is peace the absence of violence in all of these areas? Is peace the absence of just one or two? Like, what is peace and violence in relation to one another?
Yeah, great question. That's really at the heart of the discipline of peace studies. And just as there's different levels of violence, there are also different kinds of peace. And I think one of the contributions of peace studies as a discipline is to recognize that, in fact, there's no peace without justice. And so peace is not simply the absence of violence, but that it also has to counter structures of violence by creating structures of sustainable justice and peace. And these mean on all levels. So this means cultural structures, political structures, ecological structures, structures of gender relations. All these kinds of things have to be addressed in order to create a kind of sustainable peace. Now, a lot of peace scholars and peace practitioners debate amongst themselves. Do we start with one thing? Do we just try to get rid of war first, or just do we target nuclear weapons? Or do we have to do it all at once? Right? Does it make any sense to just go after nuclear weapons without eliminating the kind of implicit structures of violence in the nation state? Right? So these are real debates and important debates within the peace studies community and policy community. But certainly there's different levels of peace and different definitions of peace.
And I have a follow-up question with that. I guess, who gets to determine the difference between justice and violence? Because it seems like the people that are just saying it's justice also have access to the most violence to suppress people that would disagree with them. Yeah.
Well, this is a great question. In some ways, this goes to your reading, too. Remember the South African example, too, right? That And this also reflects a divide even within the peace community and among peace scholars. Oftentimes the question is any violence acceptable, right? Is violence acceptable in defense of the weak? Is violence acceptable in a context of overwhelming state-sponsored terrorism, like apartheid South Africa or Nazi Germany, where a nonviolent witness will, by all accounts, be ineffectual and will, in fact, lead to continuing destruction and death and injustice. So, and this is one of the contributions of liberation theology within a Christian context, and so this is a robust argument. And in fact, most peace studies scholars aren't pacifists. Well, I don't know about most. I'm not sure I can quantify that. But a significant number of peace studies scholars aren't pacifists because they recognize the importance of the use of violence at some point. And of course, it is about argument. And whose justice justice is it? Justice for whom? An old cliche, which is a cliche, but is helpful on some levels, is one man's terrorism. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right? And so for most peace scholars, one cannot simply look at the act of violence, but also has to look at the underlying structures of power, right? And who has power, who doesn't, and make that kind of analysis to think about actions. As groups relate to one another. So these are extraordinarily difficult and complex. On one level, say, oh, everybody's for peace. Well, that doesn't cut it, right? When you dig down deeper, it's much more complex than that on every level. So excellent, poignant questions. So I'm already not disappointed in your questions. So you've already passed the test.
I think I have one or two questions. One is, I'm often struck by silence when the violent extremists, which are often state-sponsored extremists, commit acts of violence by what I suspect to be a large group of believers who would condemn the violence but don't say anything, and I'm wondering if that's just because there's no access to publicizing their voice, or but what can be done about that?
Mm-hmm. So let me guess. One example might be the Muslim community after 9/11 or something like this. A lot of people raise questions: why don't they denounce the violence and things like that? It's a great question. And it's complicated. The first answer is that most did denounce the violence, but you're exactly right that they didn't have access necessarily to forms of mass communication and so forth. They also weren't always very savvy in getting their message communicated. So there is, it's not enough to be pure in principle. You also have to have strategy and tactics, right, that are effective. And so the vast majority of American Muslims and all of the leading, and I'll just speak in the American context, all of the leading organizations of American Muslims immediately and roundly and consistently denounced terrorism done in the name of Islam. They got some play in some places, but for the most part, nobody was listening or nobody heard them. But there continues to be a problem, and this is why at the end of the paper I talk about winning the argument. That these arguments happen. It's not. It's important for Muslims to tell other people that we denounce this violence. That matters, okay? Or it's important for Christians to say we don't support abortion clinic bombers, or Timothy McVeigh, or in any number of examples. Okay, so it's important to say that. More important is to win the argument inside the community, because that's where it matters. And within each of the, and this goes to Appleby's article, there's tremendous internal pluralism within each of these communities. There are religious texts and religious traditions and religious leaders that will marshal the forces of violence. And you can find warrants for that within religious texts, within the tradition, within every religion. That's why every tradition is ambivalent on these questions. And so the argument is not for pacifist Christians and pacifist Muslims to all get together and be pacifists together. The important thing is for Muslims to win the argument within Islam, for Christians to win the argument within Christianity, for Hindus to win the argument within Hinduism. So while that kind of public, solidarity with the victims is important, and saying this is not Islam, that only is the tip of the iceberg in terms of the important work the religious peace builders have to do to win the argument within the tradition. That's where the work has to happen, to marginalize, to create a space where if somebody comes up and starts to use the Quran or starts to use Bible text to inspire violence, people don't listen, right? They say that's in my text, but that has no power over me because I've interpreted my tradition differently. That's what has to happen. And it has happened in small segments. I mean, there are pacifist strains within Christianity, there are pacifist strains within Islam, there are pacifist strains within Judaism, all these different traditions, but they have to broaden that and win the argument.
I think you made a good distinction with the difference between state sponsored violence and religious violence, because I think that often it's not religion taking over government, it's government appropriating religion for political purposes.
Yeah, and there's a ton of examples of this. I mean, the wars in the former Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic, I mean, he didn't believe anything, but he was very adept at marshaling the forces and symbols and rituals of Serbian Orthodoxy, in the cause of violence. And so you're absolutely right. And this is part of our blindness. Is that we see religious terrorism. That's the problem, right? And September 11th was terrible, right? 2,000 people died, or 2,500, whatever the final number was. But how many people are dying at the hands of state-sponsored violence? And it's not a numbers game like, so we don't care about the one. No, we need to denounce all of it. But part of that has to be a recognition of the violence of the nation state. I mean, to understand Osama bin Laden, for instance, you cannot understand his violence without understanding the violence of the United States against Iraq after the Gulf War and the sanctions that the United States and the international community imposed on Iraq. Now, then you have to go back to I mean, you can always keep going further back in the chain, but that state violence that killed far more Iraqis than Osama bin Laden ever had the capacity to kill other people, that was the roots of religious radicalism for not only bin Laden, but many of his followers. And so we have to be able to critique the violence of the state as well as the violence of the non-state actor.
Thank you.
So I guess I was wondering, because we've kind of been talking about violence in like a very modern sort of sense, and we've had like these modern examples of the terrorist and these. But I guess I think of like a little bit, I'm an early modernist, and I think of historically the way that violence has kind of shifted and changed. Mm-hmm. Like witch trials, so we had to be physically violent for them to save their soul. Mm-hmm. So the greater violence for that Christian would be to not persecute, to not save their soul, right, to not give them salvation. But now if you were dunking someone till they didn't come up, that would be very violent, and the soul's kind of not the central focus anymore. So I was just wondering how we kind of differentiate between what is violent, what is Christian compassion, or compassion in another term.
No, that's a great question, and that's part of the argument that that within Christianity, and actually secularism has a lot to say about this too. But within Christianity, it was an argument, and people who said that is not Christian compassion won the argument, and so those Puritans were real Christians, right? I mean, they were dedicated, they were devout, they knew their Bible better than anyone in this room, I guarantee. Okay, probably, I don't know for sure, but probably. Okay, but they were making an argument based on the text, and over time, the Christian community decided that's not a compelling argument based on the exact same text. And so the argument changed over time. That's why Appleby talks about the growing end of an argument. It's always growing. Religion is lived. It's always evolving. And so I do think, and this is where religious peace builders don't need secularism to be a kind of bogeyman, because actually secularism has especially kind of procedural secularism has a large role to play in this in terms of creating a more tolerant, pluralistic public sphere. And actually, all the recent scholarship from a variety of different disciplines is showing now that actually religion and secularism aren't so distinct as we like to think, and as they like to, as even the practitioners like to think. So we're all in this together. And it's not religious people against Christopher Hitchens. Well, I mean, it is in a way, but ultimately, I mean, it's a human endeavor, and violence is a human problem. So we have to identify its various sources and seek to address those.
So I'm going to ask, I guess it might seem antagonistic, but I think
That's
that it needs
fine.
to be asked. So you just suggested that the Puritans knew the Bible better than anyone in this room, and I mean, they won the argument, whatever. Wouldn't the easiest way to refute any religious argument to just flat out say that justifying any argument on religious texts is invalid, just because the religious texts themselves are invalid?
Well, that is negating a huge part of human experience and epistemology, right? And why is a non-religious epistemology any more valid than a religious epistemology?
I mean, because they're not violent.
Because secular epistemologies have never been violent. I mean, this is my point. 262 million people killed in the 20th century. So do we think that secular epistemologies are inherently more peaceful than religious epistemologies?
Well, I mean, if we take the Crusades, we take the Holocaust, I mean, those...
The Holocaust is not religious violence.
What is it then?
It's secular violence.
Against religion.
No, against an ethno-religious group. It's complicated, but the Nazi state is a secular state.
Okay, so what about science? Okay, so...
I mean, let's take the Stalinist... I mean, I'm not trying to be an apologist for religion here. I actually grant your point. I mean, religion has done lots of terrible things, right?
I'm just saying that it seems like your argument is that if you discount certain textual arguments, then you win the debate. So if you discount the entire text, then you win. Okay, so if we see a problem with politics, let's discount the political text. Okay, so there's a problem with, like, the American Constitution. Let's discount that as invalid. Let's discount, like, X, Y, Z as invalid. Isn't that just the way to win all debates?
No, it's a great question. I'm not talking about discounting the entire text. I mean, we've done this with the American Constitution. The American Constitution justified slavery. We reread, we reinterpreted the American Constitution, right? We didn't get rid of it. We didn't burn it up. We amended it, and more importantly, reread it. And so the original reading of our founding documents, all people are created equal, people meant white propertied men, right? And it was all men are created equal. And so we didn't toss those out, we reread them. We made an argument about them, and we've changed the argument over time. The same is true of religious texts. I mean, this is the challenge. It is a real challenge in engaging fundamentalists and textual inerrantists, because they say every word is the word of God. Now, what they're doing is they're not recognizing their own selective retrieval of text. All of us are selectivists when we approach our sacred texts, whether they be our political texts, our religious texts, our economic texts, whatever. We're all selective. So the challenge is reinterpreting. It's creating a new hermeneutic to reinterpret those texts. We don't have to throw them away, because those texts also have the warrants and resources that are going to allow us to move towards greater peace and justice and compassion, the same way that the Constitution did. So again, it's not a secular problem or a religious problem, it's a human problem. And we all have different sources of authority, and how do we mobilize those, for greater justice? That may not be satisfying you, though.
Well, I mean, I think my problem is that, I feel like scientists don't justify violence by way of, a text. They justify it by way of experience, whereas religion is literally basing it on a text. So, I mean, I think, obviously, there's something wrong with eugenics. That's, the scientific belief that it's based on experience. I mean, to say that to distinguish between a living and a non-living thing, and to say that, so-and-so is not living, so let's kill all of it off, that's not good. I mean, madness is a good example in the 17th century.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just confused how, I'm just confused with it seems to me like what you're suggesting is that you need to like reimagine all religions, because there are certain religions that are inherently violent, certain sects of religions are inherently violent due to their interpretations of the text. For instance, like evangelicalism. I mean, something
Evangelicalism isn't inherently violent. I mean, the issue is, and I'm using text broadly. I mean, so I don't want to use a Protestant definition of religion where it's about the text, right? Religion is far broader than that, and religion is about ritual, lived practice, mysticism, all kinds of things. All of that is part of the body of authority for believers, and it works differently in different religions, right? Protestants, the text, especially evangelicals and fundamentalists, the text, the Bible, is the most important thing. Catholics, it's different. Hindus, it's different, you know, and so forth. So when I'm talking about text, or in tradition, I'm talking about tradition. It's much broader than that. But I am arguing, and I think it's a compelling argument, that within all of these traditions, religious and secular, there are resources for both violence and for peace. And I'm making a normative argument that I think that I want a world based on justice, compassion, and peace. And so I want to reshape, refashion, reinterpret, to draw on those resources to build an argument where we drown out and marginalize the resources for violence while acknowledging they're always there and problematize them, and they always speak to us. But I don't want to give those authority over the parts of the tradition that speak towards justice and peace. So it's a normative argument. There's no doubt about it. It's a normative, ethical argument in which I've made certain presumptions about what I think is the common good and the human good.
That makes sense.
Sorry, I feel like I'm monopolizing this. So I guess I was wondering, in peace studies, is there kind of a split between people are always striving for peace or people are always striving for violence? Because it kind of sounds like when we're talking about the historical, that like, well, you know, peace won out. We realized that when we reinterpreted the Puritans, like that wasn't right. Like peace kind of moves on. Does peace always win, or does can we recognize, are we now more violent than we used to be? Are there any situations like that?
Yeah, no, I mean, thanks for bringing that. I mean, I don't want to speak teleologically as if there's some kind of linear progress to this, or even inevitable progress. I don't want to speak in binaries. I mean, sometimes we're captivated by binaries, and this is a problem. Violence, peace, it's far more complicated than that. So I mean, I'm being sort of crassly reductionistic on almost everything I'm saying, but it's simply to make a kind of a heuristic point, right? And so peace doesn't always win because there's a growing end of the argument, and violence can win too, you know. And so Osama bin Laden made an argument to certain people. He recruited people. That's making an argument. And he made a persuasive argument to certain recruits based on a tradition. And so he won that argument for certain people. A lot of people rejected his argument. So it's an ongoing contestation. And of course, it's not just terrorism versus pacifism. I mean, there are so many degrees in the middle. I mean, the majority position for Christianity, especially for Roman Catholicism and for most Protestants, is a kind of just war tradition. It's actually honored mostly in the breach, in the sense that nobody actually follows the just war tradition as it's laid out. But that's the majority position. It's been stated by the church. It's been the position of the Roman Catholic Church for centuries now. And so that is a tradition that seeks to limit violence, but while recognizing that there are times where it is not only necessary but morally permissible. And so these are all arguments. It's a spectrum. It slides back and forth. There's nothing inevitable about it. And Martin Luther King made this point in the letter from Birmingham jail. He said, human progress never rolls on the wheels of inevitability. But it's always, and I'm getting this wrong, but he says it always comes through the tireless efforts of humans as co-workers with God. So I mean, that's a theological argument, but I don't. I mean, I'm a historian. I don't believe it in inevitability or teleology. Everything is contested and contingent.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question is about, I'm a little bit concerned about the usage of these terms, justice and compassion and peace, without specifically defining exactly what you mean by them. And I think you've spoken to that a little bit, but at the same time, I think that rhetorically it's a very kind of deceptive maneuver, because in a way, as you've pointed out, everybody is for those, you know, most people, Osama bin Laden is for justice and compassion and peace. He's just placing it differently. So, I mean, how would you define them? I mean, because in a way, I mean, it sounds like you're doing a lot of kind of survey and doing a very kind of, you know, showing us what each side thinks, which is very interesting. But at a certain point, it seems like your argument is, you are making an argument in favor of justice and compassion and peace. And I was wondering if you could define what that means to you, just, you know, so they don't just become kind of rhetorical terms that kind of have that sense of, you know, like, oh, well, everyone's going to agree with that.
Yeah, right.
You know?
Right. No, exactly. I mean, you can bludgeon people with words that, you know, nobody is against mothers or something like that, you know. And so, no, you're exactly right. And this piece is, I mean, it's for an Oxford handbook, so it is kind of surveying the field, and I mean, that's kind of the genre of the piece. So I'm persuaded by Scott Appleby and John Paul Lederach have this term that they have they use just peace. They use it as one word, just peace. This notion of peace with justice, and so it is and even then there's a kind of elasticity and pragmatism, at least for me. There's a kind of pragmatism in the application of it. I'm not a pure pacifist. I'm close, but I'm not a pure pacifist. And so I do think I'm also not I'm personally not a political philosopher or a philosopher of any type. And in some ways, I feel about peace and justice and compassion sort of like Justice Blackmun did about pornography. I know it when I see it. And that's not very careful, I know. And it's not very satisfactory. And so a lot of my colleagues in peace studies, a lot of the political philosophers and others are far more careful about defining their terms. And in some ways, I'll defer to them, and I sort of import some of their usages of terms and so forth. And so I can point out what violence looks like, what structural violence looks like, what cultural violence looks like, what direct violence looks like. I can point out what right relationships of sustainable justice and harmony look like on both an individual level, on a communal level, on an international level. I can point that out. I'm personally not given towards encapsulating that in a kind of one or two sentence or paragraph or book length definition. That's just not what I do. And so I know that's not very satisfactory, and it leaves a kind of messiness that I'm actually kind of personally okay with, because I think it can be applied variously. I mean, I'll leave that to Patricia and the philosophers to be more precise. And that is, I'll readily admit that there's a kind of fuzziness to what I'm talking about. But I do think, I think I can go toe to toe with Osama bin Laden. And okay, let's talk about peace and what it looks like. Let's talk about ends and means. Let's talk about non-combatants. Let's talk about, okay, let's talk about justice. Yeah, you're absolutely right about those Iraqi children who were killed by sanctions, right? So let's talk about justice. You're absolutely right. So we can talk about all these things and talk about them in the concrete realities of human lives. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thanks.